well, off we go. Thanks everyone for joining. We're here with Carbon Leadership Forum in Los Angeles. We're going to be talking about the new CalGreen code that just recently passed and will be going into effect next year. Some intro stuff here as people are still joining. I see a lot of familiar faces, but for those who are new to the Carbon Leadership Forum Los Angeles hub here, this is the stellar group of instigators that put on these monthly either webinars or happy hours. Hopefully people check out our website and join our mailing list. And we always trying to kind of bring forward just like this, like interesting new topics all around embodied carbon. And typically on these monthly webinars, we also like to highlight some news in which there's been like a lot. So we'll pause here, and if folks want to drop stuff in the chat as well, these are just a few things that I pulled together like last minute. There's lots of stuff happening this week with it being Climate Week in New York. Some exciting things that I just saw was there was a big announcement that a commitment to purchasing green steel that was just saw published in Canary Media. Also last week, California published some disclosure laws around Scope 3 emissions, which I think will have a big impact on this space. In the last month, Vancouver also published updated guidelines for their embodied carbon policy. And while all this is happening this week, there's protests going on in New York around ending fossil fuels. There's new resources being published specifically around building materials. So generally, lots of excitement. And I don't know, I'll pause there and see if anyone else has anything they care to add. Feel free to unmute and chime in. This is generally sort of a relatively informal forum here of Los Angeles folks. So feel free to pipe up or speak out. Any other news from folks? And I think Sandy, I also put those links in the, if you want to share some of the links to some of this from the presentation. If not, I'll keep rolling as well because we have a lot to cover. A couple upcoming events that folks might be interested in. We have a tour of Straw Bale House. There's a great little mini doc by Patagonia. If folks haven't seen it. I think we are now at capacity for this on Saturday. We'll be sure to share pictures and put it up on our website. And another event that's kind of around the corner is with CS Sustainability Committee and the Young Member Committee. So structural engineers here local, this will be kind of a fun opportunity to get together as well. Okay, so the meat of things today is really a CalGreen presentation. We have two very special guests, which I'm excited to introduce here in a second, who are really preeminent leaders in the space of embodied carbon policy and code writing. And so we'll have a presentation about that, and then like a big portion of the time here, hopefully in this hour-long session, will be around question and discussion. So without further ado, I want to introduce Webley Bowles and Anish Tilak. So there we go. Webley is Associate Director of Codes and Policy at the New Buildings Institute. She's a licensed architect, as well as a avid gardener, I know. Before she joined NBI, she worked as an energy analyst at Empower Oregon, and generally is just a like major voice and leader and engage with lots of things in this space. Similarly, Anish at Rocky Mountain Institute, he's part of their carbon-free buildings program and manages projects in the Pathways to Zero initiative. Similarly, these two are like the two kind of thought leaders in this space, and I know have advocated both here in California as well as at a national scale. And been like very lucky to kind of see their work and follow along as part of this CalGreen initiative, and excited to hear what they have to share with this group today. So without further ado, I'm going to stop, and so Webley can share her screen and get rolling.
Great. Thank you for the introduction, Luke. Really appreciate it. I try to fumble my way through sharing my slides. So there we go. Is it presenting? Yes, great. So again, my name's Webley Bowles. I work at New Buildings Institute. I have been working on trying to get embodied carbon in the building codes for about 3.5 years now. And we were successful in California. So it's really exciting. A little bit about New Buildings Institute, if you're not familiar with us. We work to move towards carbon-free buildings, and we do that through these 5 different policy foundations, and embodied carbon is over there on the right, and that's the little island that I live on. So those that are not familiar with embodied carbon, being part of the Carbon Leadership Forum in Los Angeles, I imagine that you are. But this is the important aspect when we look at the 39% of GHG emissions associated with buildings. 11% of that is associated with embodied carbon. I hope y'all have heard of that before. This is not the first time you're hearing it. And likewise, when we look at the cradle to gate embodied carbon of a building, the majority of it is associated with the structure. So this is a chart from the AIA Large Firm Roundtable, and it kind of breaks down these 3 major components. So I like to show this graph to say that, yes, this is kind of the upfront embodied carbon, but as we look at that life cycle, that 20% that you see right there for interiors starts to grow over the life of the building. If you're familiar with the book, How Buildings Learn, that is the aspect that those products are kind of changing way more frequently than the envelope or the structure. So as I mentioned, MBI has been working within different policies to advance embodied carbon. We've been working at the state level, building codes, local codes, and as well as utility incentives. And so within each of these, there's a bunch of different levers that can be pulled to try to advance embodied carbon. You've seen Buy Clean procurement policies. There's also different incentives that jurisdictions can provide, different green building rating systems within the building codes. There's REACH codes, stretch codes, green codes that can incorporate different embodied carbon requirements. There's a lot of different municipal codes. You've heard of Marin County's concrete code, that is a county code. Zoning codes, like what's happening in BC, is also really important. And as we start to look, as utilities start to look not just at kWh and therm savings, but as GHG emissions, we're going to see more utility programs that are finding different ways that they can start to look at embodied carbon. So this is a map from Carbon Leadership Forum's website showing where different policies are across the US, a little bit of North America, with Canada and Mexico in there. And just to go through a couple of them, I imagine that y'all are pretty familiar with many of these, but just to show you a smattering of them. So Buy Clean California is a procurement strategy that requires the state agencies and universities to procure specific products with a specific GWP limit. Does not include concrete. The Portland Low Carbon Concrete Initiative does only include concrete. New Jersey's Buy Clean does something a little bit different than just setting GWP limits on concrete, but it also has a bid discount for state projects, as well as a tax credit for concrete producers who overperform those GWP limits. City of Austin has a green building program that is required in certain areas, similar to a zoning code, and they include LCA within there. The Denver Green Code was the first jurisdiction to include embodied carbon in its code, so it requires GWP limits for concrete and steel. CalGreen, we will get into that quite a bit today, so I'll skip the details there. ASHRAE 189.1 becomes the IGGC, the International Green Construction Code, while it's not used in California, it's still a pretty influential code across the United States and how policy is set. And I've been working within ASHRAE 189.1 for the last 3.5 years, and we have been looking at different ways to present this information. So there's two different measures that are moving forward there. One is setting EPD collection requirements for 30 different products, as well as a second one that sets GWP limits on a certain number of products, and it sets that GWP limit at 125% of that industry-wide EPD. So a lot of details there. Since it's not California specific, I'm not going to go into it, but happy to talk to you about it through the Q&A. And then there's a lot of other codes that are moving forward. Marin County, I'm continuing to work with the International Building Code. Seattle Building Code is moving forward. Oregon REACH Code is moving forward as well. So there's a lot of activity that's happening around this. And I think that with California being the first state to require it for buildings over 100,000 square feet, we're going to see a lot more progress a lot faster as the dominoes start to fall in a very good way. So looking at federal activities, there's the Federal Buy Clean initiative that was passed a year and a half ago. And it's requiring that each of the agencies has their own Buy Clean initiative. So Federal Highway Administration, GSA, have started setting limits for their specific products. After that Federal Buy Clean initiative was passed, the EPA, the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act passed, and that included trillions of dollars, and much of it for low embodied carbon materials. So you can see the different sections across here. EPA has $350 million for developing a low carbon labeling program, as well as to provide grants and technical assistances to be able to get the EPDs out there to help move the industry along. And then the GSA, Federal Highway Administration, HUD, FEMA all have funding to be able to procure more of these materials. So I'm going to go into the CalGreen requirements, and two things I want to say. One is that this goes into effect July 1st, 2024. And the second is that there's a lot of questions and we want to make sure that we capture them because we are working on an FAQ. So if you have questions, I'm happy to answer them. I am not reviewing the chat while I'm presenting. So Luke or Sandy, if one of y'all want to like pipe in and say like, this is really important, we got to talk about this now, feel free. Happy to pause on this.
I can help on that. I'll monitor the chat and feel free, please use the chat for questions, y'all.
Thank you. So these are the three different paths. So it's one measure with three different options and three different tiers. So there's the mandatory tier and then two voluntary tiers. So I think you can see my cursor. So the life cycle analysis is the first one, and this is a whole building LCA. And you can see down here for the mandatory requirement for whole building LCA, it is a 10% reduction from the baseline. As you go up in tiers, 15%, 20%. And I have some of the details here. Anish is going to go over this in more detail. So I'm going to leave that there for a second. The prescriptive path is looking at the primary materials that are in Buy Clean California plus concrete. And we have the GWP limits that are set at 175% of the industry-wide average for the mandatory, 150% for the tier 1, and then tier 2 is aligned with Buy Clean California at the industry-wide EPD. And then for the building reuse components, this is obviously only available if you are reusing a building. There are exceptions for products that are unsound to be used within construction because they're either rotted or that's just not a viable product. And for the mandatory component, that is 45% of the structure and enclosure to be reused. So I have some of the details up here, but I'm going to focus a little bit more on the prescriptive path. I do want to note a couple things about whole building LCA here, is that whole building LCA has been growing, and we really think that this is going to be the path that most design firms use. So this the numbers on the far left is AIA's 2030 challenge and how many projects have been reporting embodied carbon. And you can see that growth year over year is pretty drastic. And we know that projects that are over 100,000 square feet are more likely the firms that are reporting to the 2030 challenge. And so we're anticipating that this is where most of those projects are going to be choosing that path. And Anish will start to get into the worksheets here. Just wanted to show that, like, yes, there is some documentation that has been set up to be able to support that process. We have started to think through ways that you can incorporate different components into your requirements, because really only the reporting form is what is needed. But it's important, as you know, to put the requirements within the specifications, within the CDs, the bid documents, reviewing things through the submittal review process and understanding what was included or not included within closeout. So we have some of these in here just as recommendations, and we're going to continue to build on this through really important conversations like this. So building reuse, 45% of the existing primary structural elements, enclosure, windows, assemblies, and insulation, assuming all of that is viable, can be counted towards that 45%. And again, if you've worked with CalGreen, you know that they love worksheets. You know you have to put those in your CDs. So this is just the template of what that looks like. And again, different ways to incorporate this within specifications, drawings, bid documents, how to verify during construction, closeout, and then really that enforcement from the state is that worksheet. The prescriptive path, as I mentioned before, is aligned with Buy Clean California plus concrete. And one thing that we hear frequently is that, why are the numbers so high? And the numbers are high because when we put this proposal together, we really just wanted to move the industry from voluntary to mandatory. So there was whole building LCA and reuse already within CalGreen, and we moved those from voluntary to mandatory. We also wanted a prescriptive option, and so we brought in what was already included in Buy Clean and added concrete because we kept hearing from everyone that this was an important element to include. And because this is newer to CalGreen, we wanted to make sure that it wasn't taking us too far away from what was already known. And so we get some comments that the GWP values are really high and really easy to achieve. And that is true for the mandatory section if you choose to take this path. As I mentioned before, with projects at this size, we believe that many of them will be using the whole building LCA path. The other component to here is that because we have the tiered structure, we have jurisdictions that are able to adopt that tier 1 or tier 2, which would require a lower GWP limit and a higher percentage of whole building LCA reduction. So these are the GWP limits that you see here for the different products, unit of measurement. And then over here, we have the concrete values. And with the concrete values, they are allowed to do a weighted average. So concrete is considered one product category when you do this. So you have to look at all of your different concrete and use this calculation to determine what that allowable GWP is and what your actual GWP is from that weighted average. One other thing I forgot to mention here is that we are allowing product-specific or factory-specific type 3 EPDs at this time. Product-specific is much more where the industry is now, but we want to get to factory-specific in the future. So I imagine that in future code cycles, we might see the product-specific move away. So there is a worksheet for this. I think I pulled the wrong worksheet here. This is for whole building LCA. Similar to the other ones, we did provide some guidelines on how you can incorporate the requirements into the specifications, into the other contract documents. and verify at the end of the project. And there is this note down at the bottom that says that the enforcing agency may require inspection and inspection reports in accordance with the sections, blah, 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 during or at completion of construction to demonstrate substantial conformance. So this is in there as a way to allow special review at the end of the project. And that was at the guidance of the building inspectors to make sure that there was an extra layer of verification if there was any question. So we received a couple questions in advance. One of those was, well, actually, let me just pause for a second. Luke, I'm not giving you a chance to jump in. Is there anything in the chat that we need to address right away?
So there's a question about baseline setting, which I think Anish is going to tackle. And then
yeah.
there's a question asking if structural concrete and envelope concrete fall under the same category.
So it is just ready mix concrete. So what do you mean by envelope concrete? I guess would be my question.
I think that if it was like a precast facade or
okay. Yeah, so precast is it's under a different product category rule, so it would be excluded. That's good clarification. So one of the questions, go ahead, Luke.
Sorry, I think there's one other question. So agreeing that embodied carbon limits for concrete are high, why 175% and not?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that was because that was the introduction way to get this into CalGreen. With the other components, the reuse and whole building LCA, those are already in there as voluntary. So it was kind of easy to slide them into the mandatory slot. And with the prescriptive approach, we aligned with what was happening with Buy Clean. And because of that, we needed to align it with the percentage of where reuse and whole building LCA were. And so that's where we ended up with that 175% was that it was achievable without too much of a stretch, but it's still going to move the market because it is requiring EPDs for these individual products. It's starting that education, that collection process, incorporation into specifications, into CDs, into bid documents, getting the contractors on board to start collecting those, preparing the manufacturers to start providing those. So it's more of an introduction.
And I would just add real very quick on the folks who are less familiar with CalGreen, which as a structural engineer I've never had to look at CalGreen before, but the tiers are a voluntary measure, which sort of also indicate kind of where the industry is going. So I think you know, that 175% is what is mandatory now, but the way CalGreen works is those tiers are sort of like a roadmap for the future too. That reductions are, a lower threshold might be what is adopted in future code iterations.
That's a great point, Luke. As I mentioned, some of these were moving from voluntary to mandatory, and we see that same pathway planned, see if it actually gets passed, for this embodied carbon, where this in future years, this tier 1 would become the mandatory, tier 2 would become tier 1, etc. So we'd move that along. So it's really about adopting the structure to be able to introduce it to the industry and help advance this original structure. So there's a question about how is CalGreen different from LEED? And so I pulled the LEED procurement of low carbon construction material products. And you can see how this short list of CalGreen products, which is same as Buy Clean, except for that ready mix one at the bottom, aligns with what is required for LEED. The LEED versus CalGreen requirements. For CalGreen, you're just providing EPDs and meeting a specific GWP target based on the products that were installed. for LEED, you're also providing EPDs based on the products that were installed, but you're also doing this calculation that is looking at the quantity of the product that is being installed in the project and making sure that the difference between the baseline and the actual product is a specific percentage reduction in range. And then the other question is, what happens if you don't have an EPD? Well, with CalGreen, you don't really comply. It is required. There's no alternative path there. And within LEED, they say, just try to find one. If you can't, then you can use the industry-wide EPD. But because CalGreen was based upon meeting a specific GWP limit that was higher than the industry-wide average, it didn't work out to be able to allow that. So a team would either have to comply with one of the other two embodied carbon paths. So I'm going to leave it there because I'm sure that there are way more questions for Anish as we get into whole building LCA. There are some resources up here. You can see the link down at the bottom, and I can throw that in the chat as well if anybody is interested in MBI's resources on embodied carbon.
Webley, there's one more prescriptive path question. It asked, so when prescriptive path starts to go from the product level to the facility level, will an analysis of transportation of lower embodied carbon product from a further distance be considered?
Potentially. We are not drafting that next version yet. If that's something that it seems like the data is available to the market or is just about available to the market, that's definitely something that we want to look at and consider.
Great, thank you.
All right, Anish, you're up.
All right, thanks, Webley. Let me share my screen. Okay. So Webley already went through this, but I did want to start by highlighting what's happening at the federal level, just because you all are leaders in this space and in your region on the topic of embodied carbon. So the intent of the CalGreen requirements are to set a floor for all projects, but we don't want to like stifle innovation. So, as you're working on projects, you've already in the chat been saying the standards are, not as ambitious as you would like to see them. Definitely push your projects as hard as you can, because there's a lot happening at the federal level in terms of incentives to really create demand for low carbon building materials that have really low GWP associated with their products. So one thing that I wanted to highlight is so GSA, which is the building portfolio manager for the federal government, has a huge amount of funding for to actually procure low carbon building materials for their projects, and these are the sort of percentile thresholds that they're using to give out that incentive, those incentive dollars. So they're looking at the top 20% of 20th percentile of a survey of EPDs. So those are sort of the benchmarks that you all should be using in your projects, and you will automatically meet CalGreen. So I just wanted to start there by saying, you guys should go beyond. But digging into CalGreen in more specific detail, there's the three different pathways that Webley has outlined really well, and I really wanted to focus on the whole building lifecycle assessment pathway to kind of provide clarifications and read through the language with you all, because I know one of the challenges and certainly some of the pushback that we've heard associated with whole building LCA is that baselining is relative, so it's very difficult to set standards and rules for what's in the baseline. So we've tried to do that explicitly in the code language. However, we think there's an opportunity in the guidelines that the state will put out associated with this to really refine this and have a really strong set of criteria for what should be modeled for the baseline. So this group is the kind of perfect group to get some of that information out. So after I present, we'll definitely want to do more of a discussion to hear from you on what you would like to see in those guidelines. So going into the language itself, I've highlighted here, what the description of the baseline building is. So first of all, the whole building LCA covers each life cycle stage from cradle to grave, excluding operating energy. That's fairly typical, but that's just an important distinction to make. And then if we're talking about the baseline, the way we're defining it is a baseline building of similar size, function, complexity, type of construction, material specification, and location. So, and that it meets the energy code. So it really provides some guardrails for project teams to, not include as a baseline an unrealistic building type. So that's kind of the first level of information to define the baseline. And then, of course, you see here, there's some information about reference standards and qualifying software that can be used to conduct that whole building LCA. And then in the notes, there's some guidance on what software is recommended for use. And they're the typical ones that I'm sure you all are familiar with for doing whole building LCA. Athena, OneClick, tallies on here as well. And then, as Webley shared, there is a worksheet, which I will come back to shortly, but there is a worksheet that will be included in the drawing sets. You'll populate it and it'll be included in the drawing sets. And that also creates a standardized way for the jurisdictions and then ultimately the state and our community to start to collect this data so we can move away from this relative benchmarking of you set your own baseline and then have a percentile reduction from that. I think in future iterations of this code, we hope that we can actually set an absolute benchmark because that will be much clearer for the industry. So going into some specific language about what building components are included in the model. So this would be for both baseline and proposed, but what is the scope of this study? And so you can see here, we have building enclosure components, being glazing assemblies, insulation, exterior finishes. And then we're looking at primary and secondary structural members that include the footings, foundations, structural columns, beams, walls, roofs, and floors. So this is the definition for what building components are used. And I think we're already receiving some questions and clarifications about whether this needs even more refinement or just more specific definition in the guidelines, and that's certainly something we can provide. So if you have feedback on that, definitely share it in the chat, and then we can take that as we develop FAQs, responses, and also guidelines with the state partners. The reference study period is 60 years. That aligns as well with the LEED whole building LCA credit. So for the most part, this, although the prescriptive section does not align with the kind of LEED low carbon construction pilot credit, the whole building LCA should, for the most part, align. Like LEED actually has even less guidance for what building components should be used. So we're hopeful that this course sort of has like a reciprocal benefit of helping LEED project teams standardize what they're using and including in the scope of their whole building LCA. Here's the template in a little bit more, in a larger format. So you can see that you would basically, itemize per life cycle stage what your baseline structure and enclosure GWP is, and then model your proposed case, and then it would auto-calculate a % reduction. There are optional scope items. So for example, if you're doing a whole building LCA for a client and you're including all these additional things, that data is still useful to provide. So you can input it there, but it wouldn't be counted as your % reduction for meeting the code requirement. And this template is modeled after the CLF intake form that they've been using to gather whole building LCAs from design firms. So it should look fairly familiar, and we're going to be working with CLF to host a site where you could actually submit this data. And so CLF can in the future start to benchmark this information. I'll pause there, and I'm sure there's open the chat and look at any questions.
So there's one question, Anish. Are you suggesting that a baseline building can vary between companies, i.e. individual companies can use their own LCA databases to establish a benchmark building for a specific project? Would a project team need to submit the LCA results for the baseline building in addition to the new building?
Got it. Yes. So the baseline building, if it wasn't clear here, is that you're going to be modeling a baseline building of the same size, function, complexity. So it's not like your firm would have one generic baseline that you're using, that you build once and then you're going to use it for all of your project, certainly like the assumptions you might have as a standard assumption, but you are going to be using the same model, so to speak, like the same Rhino model or Revit model to get the material quantities for that building. So the baseline building is for that project. It's not just a generic the baseline or benchmark.
It's not from an external benchmarking study or internal benchmarking study. It's from the building itself.
Yes. Yeah.
Right.
So and so typically, you could start this analysis as early as schematic design, and that's when you could really optimize your design from a design efficiency perspective before you get into material procurement. And then I think the second part of that question was about, are you submitting LCA results for the baseline and the new building? Yes. So because the requirement you see here at the very top, it's not highlighted, but it says demonstrating a minimum 10% reduction, you will be submitting the data for the baseline building and the proposed building, and then the percentage is calculated based on that. I'm looking at the next question.
There's one other question that came in previously around scope. Would materials outside the building envelope be included, i.e. like sidewalks and stuff? And Webley did answer it in the chat, but I think you addressed it in your section, Anish, but if you'd like to speak to it around this.
Yes, they wouldn't be included.
I do just want to call out, so there's a question like, could it be included in the future? And I think the answer is always like, yes, we can always look to include additional components into CalGreen. But we would want to look at the best place for that to be. Like that could be within the site section, because I believe that the section that we've been working in 5.4 is specifically for buildings.
Exactly.
And I also add that we shouted out Vancouver at the beginning of the call, and we have Anthony who leads the CLF group up there. Just reshared the link to their policy guidelines, and just to reiterate that this area is like continued development and precedent. Like Vancouver is doing a lot of great work and leading precedent and research around this, so something that continues to develop.
Sorry, I joined the call late, but yeah, I didn't realize.
Yeah,
but
no, thanks for sharing,
Thanks.
Anthony, and thanks for sharing.
Yeah, that's great. And one of the reasons we're excited about this is because it's the first whole building LCA requirement at the state level in the U.S. But this is more of the policy approach that's followed in other countries and jurisdictions like Vancouver. So there's a lot of learning that we're going to be doing, in terms of getting the guidelines right. So we have some good precedents, as Luke mentioned, to pull from.
So there's another question that just popped up, and sometimes Zoom kind of bounces around. So if you ask a question and you see it is forgotten, please feel free to message again. But so this latest question is, should the proposed LCA design be modeled with product specific EPDs based on approved submittals close to the end of construction administration?
Yes, that's a really good question, and it's one of the challenges with whole building LCA. Our intent is that yes, you would, if you're in your whole building LCA that you're submitting as part of your construction documents, making an assumption that you're achieving a certain GWP and making certain product specific EPD assumptions, you will follow through with a submittal review process during CA. And that would be what you would be inspected against, or the jurisdiction decides to like audit your project. You would have documentation showing that you didn't, just make up some numbers for your proposed case in your whole building LCA. You really did follow through. So yes, you would want to. The intent is that you would follow through with product specific EPDs. And similarly for the baseline, I think this is part of the guidelines that we'll have to develop is, what's a reasonable assumption for what's included as the GWP in your baseline. And so that's certainly an area that, if you're doing whole building LCAs at your firm and doing, baselining for, say, a LEED credit, we would be happy to get that input on, what are some reasonable, bookends for GWP values for these key materials that you're going to be modeling in your baseline building. I see more questions, but I'm not opening the chat.
Yep.
So Luke,
So,
you'll have to read them to me.
No, I'm trying to keep my arms around them. But there's a question about, do we know if CalGreen has discussed penalties for non-compliance with these measures?
I'm not privy to that at the moment. Webley, do you have any insight? I don't think so. Not at the moment.
Yeah, I can speak to that just a little bit. I'm actually not that familiar with the penalties, but there are penalties, and I don't know. I believe it's by jurisdiction. Someone can correct me if I'm wrong there. How penalties for non-compliance works, but I don't know what those numbers are, and I don't even know if they've been developed per jurisdiction.
And one other question on the prescriptive path. So what would happen if someone doesn't have an EPD?
Like they had planned to do it, and for some reason something fell apart at the very end.
Yeah, right. Or say there's a construction change.
Yeah, I mean, these things happen in construction. There's a couple different paths. One is to beg for forgiveness, and two is to document everything to show that you did everything right in whatever fell through. Maybe it was like 2 months after the EPD that you thought that you were going to use expired and they hadn't got a new one. Most inspectors will work with you to find ways that you show that you did the best you did. If you just ignored the entire thing, I think that is when the penalty really comes down. But that's up to each jurisdiction.
But in the California market, there should be EPDs available for all of these covered materials.
Let's see, and then there's a follow-up from John, and feel free to unmute yourself, John, if you'd like. But it is a clarification on, so the benchmark building is the same building, just using benchmark EPD data rather than product-specific data.
Yes, that is correct. And if that is a point of contention or question that this group has on what type of guidance you'll get for baselining in terms of the GWP benchmark assumptions, that is definitely an area we will work to develop more guidance on. It's hard to put that directly in the code language, but the guidance will be a good place for that to sit.
Yeah, and I think that's something that Anthony, you all wrestled with quite a bit up there in Vancouver as well. Is thinking about those
Yes.
reductions.
We've tackled many of these thorny questions, but yeah.
So that's a great resource for people to read and reference as well. I think, okay, and then there's one other question. What percentage of projects do we think will go whole building LCA versus prescriptive?
I think Webley said it, I think that we see design firms more likely to do whole building LCA because it's starting to become more of a normal workflow for design firms as they consider embodied carbon. But we'll have to see.
What Anish said. I don't want to put like a 62% because I don't know that we'll know that in the end.
Yeah, we'll see how it plays out, I suppose. I think that is all the questions. If I missed any questions, speak now, raise your hand, or we keep rolling.
Sounds good. And yeah, so one point about, folks choosing the whole building LCA path, you all are likely aware of Assembly Bill 2446, which basically gives authority to CARB, the Air Resources Board for the state, to start to benchmark embodied carbon for buildings. And so one of the goals of CalGreen and this requirement is that the data feeding up from this requirement can help inform CARB's benchmarks going forward. And so I think that's one of the reasons why we also see whole building LCA as a pathway that firms will choose to take.
Can I ask a question on that, Anish? Because there are other benchmarking efforts going on, like with the Carbon Leadership Forum. Do you see anything like that influencing future code or like
Definitely
performance limits?
Definitely. Yeah, I think that we're in the stage of a lot of these studies happening, and once they're completed, I know CLF has like a California specific benchmarking study that they're gonna release results for. But we need very solid footing to stand on before we can set that absolute benchmark. But hopefully in the next code cycle, that would be something we could do. Yeah, I know we're running short on time, so I'm gonna just roll through the building reuse credit. I just wanted to make sure that folks understand how the calculation is done. So this is an incentive essentially, or an exemption if you're doing an adaptive reuse project or doing an addition, but you're preserving an existing building project and you're maintaining 45% of envelope and structure, you can do a more simplistic calculation and comply with the embodied carbon requirement in CalGreen. And so this provides kind of detail on what's included. Again, it matches the whole building LCA in terms of covered scopes. I will say that you'll see here that window assemblies, insulation, will not be included in the calculation. Reason being is like we want people to improve the energy performance of those existing buildings. So those elements are specifically excluded from the calculation. So that's the one primary difference that you'll see. And happy to answer any questions on that. And in terms of the calculation, it's done similar to, there's a lead credit that's similar to this one. And so you're going to do the, calculate the floor area that you had in the existing building before, what's being retained, you get a percentage. And the same thing for the different enclosure components. And then, when you actually total it out for the whole project, you're not going to just like add the percentages and divide by 2. It's based on the total area. So if you have, 100 square feet of floor area, but only 10 square feet of enclosure, obviously the floor area gets more weight there. So it's a total area calculation. So just wanted to clarify and make sure that folks understand that. And then you see here at the bottom on this table that there's also interior non-structural elements included. The language that I've showed here is for the mandatory provision, but in the tiers, there are higher levels of performance that are set. And so for the reuse credit or the reuse measure, the interior non-structural elements component is associated with the tier 2 compliance pathway. So that's where that fits in. And yeah, here's just like a demo. It's from the lead form. So if you've done this credit before, you are probably familiar with it. But yeah, that's the reuse pathway. If there's any any questions on that, happy to answer it, and I'll stop sharing as well.
So there's one question, but I think it's not on the reuse bit, unless Abby, correct me if I'm wrong, but Abby is asking about gypsum wallboard being included in the building components. That's not specific to reuse, is it, Abby, or is that referencing the LCA?
No, it was the building components 5.409.2.1. Sorry, it was a little further back. I was just making sure I understood it. Sorry to jump around.
Yes. The interior gypsum board is currently not included in the building components. It's glazing assemblies, insulation, and exterior finishes. In the tiers, I think there's like additional guidance for like interior, if you're including interior finishes, and we'll provide that. But in like the base language, the gyp board would not be included.
Okay, thank you.
And one other question back to whole building LCA, in talking about the baselining and using product specific EPDs, what implication does that have for tools like Tally that don't have those product specific EPDs?
That's a good question. Are you saying that you are not able to substitute like a GWP value in Tally in order to so if you have a product specific EP, you can't manually replace the GWP value?
You cannot manually replace it, correct?
Got it. Got it. Yeah, my experience has been using one click for whole building LCA where you can do that, but that's a really good flag. If you have any suggestions for like how you would adjust, you can adjust it in Excel, folks are saying. Yeah, I think that's likely the pathway, is to adjust. Yeah, basically do a post
process.
Yes, yeah.
I will add, so in the language, which is linked in the event on our website here, there's a list of the tools that are available, and one of them, which folks may or may not be familiar with, but there's I think it's called Planetary LC. It's a one-click, but it's a free version, is my understanding. I haven't used it personally, but just to share that is also out there.
Yeah, Luke, or maybe I just wanted to say something on the Tally point. That's also one of the reasons why in the Vancouver guidelines, we allowed for the inclusion of EC3. And by extension, the TallyCat tool built on top of it is partly because a lot of the EPDs are in that. And TallyCat's being developed to try to hopefully bring in some of the functionality of Tally, but map to the EC3 database. And my understanding is that they are planning to build out those later life cycle stages. So we have some temporary factors to kind of deal in the interim, given that it's just A1 to A3, but it's more with a longer term vision of like where things are going. That's one of the things. And yeah, these manual hacks on Tally is not ideal, but that is how some people are addressing that, especially in Canada, because those concrete mixes don't work for Canada right now, but there are people that use up here. So those are some of the things that we've contended with here.
Yeah, fingers crossed that the building transparency folks continue to build that out.
Yeah, hopefully.
Okay, a couple more questions rolling in. For calculating reuse percentage, is it volume, linear feet, or what unit is that, Anish?
It's calculated differently for the different systems. So if it's like a column, it's linear feet. But I think that, yeah, it's overall you're basically, it's definitely not volume. It's either linear feet or square feet. So it's just an area calculation.
So if you had like a 10-story building and you reused 4 of the stories, you would take the area of the 4 stories from the total square foot, and then you would take the area of the envelope.
Yes, but it is by structural component. So you would basically calculate like your floor area and then your structural area, if it, columns, beams. If you have interior structural shear walls or something like that, you'd calculate those things separately and then add them all up.
Great, thank you. And then, okay, so beyond square feet, what causes a building to be, yeah, okay, sorry. Beyond square feet, what causes a building project to be required to comply with these measures? Is it only greater than 100,000 square feet?
It's non-residential projects larger than 100,000 square feet.
And
And
schools for 50,000 square feet.
And a
Sorry.
Go ahead, Leslie.
state housing is excluded.
Any stated definition on structurally sound, example as a non-ductile shear wall considered unsound. And Genevieve, feel free to unmute if you want and ask any questions.
I was just looking that up and it just says structurally unsound or hazardous. And hazardous materials that are, yeah, so
I can
I
up
think
to
that
the
needs a
engineer
definition.
to prove to the, what we would consider to be unsound, and then that impacts what we consider the percentage to be. Is that kind of the intent?
Yeah, it's removed from the percentage. I do think that I'm going to check to see if that's defined anywhere else in CalGreen or in Title 24, anywhere else in Title 24.
Right. Yeah. The exclusions are, you wouldn't include that in, because the reuse is still sort of like a baseline proposed situation. So you would exclude it from your baseline too, because they don't want you to be penalized for including those materials in your baseline.
So we've just a couple minutes left and a couple quick questions. Can you define how residential is defined? Like if it's a 5/2, like is there a difference between commercial, residential, and
There is, I forget this for this code.
I
Does
think
anyone else?
it is defined in the architectural code, yeah.
It's definitely defined. I just forget it.
Yeah, I'll have to look at it. My recollection is that it is like for a mixed use project is like you actually split it, so the non-residential space would be covered, but I need to double check on that.
And I think we only have time for this last question, but it's also on the reuse. So if you use 60% of the structural slabs, but not use anything else, could you still meet the 45% reuse?
Right. I mean, you'd have to do the calculation more specifically because you're going to have to include all those components that you didn't reuse in that baseline. So you'll have to calculate like what was existing, what are all the structural components existing, what have I retained, 60%. That gets you above 45%, but there's likely a bunch of other stuff that you didn't reuse that will bring you below 45%. So that's why you're kind of tallying up like all of the stuff that is in the existing building.
Awesome. We're at time. Thank you so much, both of you, Webley and Anish. I'm sure this is like just the beginning and there's a lot of education and outreach. And as you mentioned, there'll be more resources in the near future, but really appreciate taking the time with us today, as well as all the work that you've done leading up to this. It's a huge effort and definitely a service to the industry. So thank you. And for everyone else, we'll still be here and I'm sure we'll be talking more about baselines and all sorts of topics, how to do LCA. But thanks for everyone joining and hope to see some folks on Saturday.
Thanks for bringing us together, Luke. Bye, Anish.
Thank you all.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you all.
I saved the chat for the guidelines, so we can.
Perfect. I have it in a side document as well.
I've been writing them down.
Thanks for your input, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.